Welcome to another episode of Self-Wired. Today we'll be going over the placebo effect and the implications it has on our everyday life as well as in psychology and medicine in general. Listen up, plebes, because it is all in your head. All your strife, everything that you're dealing with is nothing but an illusion.
Yes, we have our boy Marcus Aurelius here, former emperor of Rome, dropping some red pills, as you can see, some truths. Now, I know we talked about the purple pill before, but the
Yes.
red pill just really adds to the effect we're going for, which is that the placebo is not just a sham in that it has no effect, but in fact, there is power in the registering of something that might not really be a medicine as we think about it, but it's a medicine because we perceive it as that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the power of the placebo. So buckle up, commoners, because we're about to get into some science, and we're also about to philosophize a little bit
Oh, yeah.
about what the placebo is and how we can use the placebo to our advantage.
Mhm.
Let's start off with the basics, definitions. Um, Placebo, like we said, you usually view it as a sham, something that has no effect. It's the sugar pill. They give it. It's used primarily to test the efficacy of drugs and drug trials. So they'll give one group a drug they're testing, and then they'll give the other group a placebo. So nothing. It's not supposed to have any effect. At least that's what you think. However, there's a whole body of scientific literature that talks about the placebo and its magnitude of effect. And sometimes, even in some cases, when they're trying to make a drug, they'll find the placebo as effective as the drug itself. Therefore, the drug's not even that effective. Um, so that is, in essence, what the placebo is. It doesn't have to just be a pill. It can be, a cream, ointment. It could be we'll talk about dummy acupuncture where they make it seem like you're actually getting acupuncture, but you're not. It can be a
Fake
range of
surgery.
different things. Say it again.
A fake surgery.
A fake surgery, exactly. Anything that can be administered to you that you believe to have healing properties is a placebo.
Right. So, as Noah was getting into, the placebo is a control. So you hear, oh, this drug didn't work any better than the placebo pill. Therefore, the drug didn't work whatsoever. When in reality, when you look at it, these placebos oftentimes work incredibly well. So this isn't comparing to nothing, because the placebo in reality, while it isn't a genuine medication that was created in a lab to work on whatever ailment it needs to work on, it was it's just a piece of sugar, like a bread pill, for example. It's nonetheless, it is something that's incredibly potent, and in most cases there's a heavy placebo response. And then getting into the nocebo is the exact opposite. So it's they might give you a placebo and say, here, this will help you with your pain management, or this will help you with your depression, this will help you with whatever's wrong with you, your tennis elbow, whatever. The nocebo is saying this will increase the pain, or brace for impact, more pain is coming, worsening of symptoms are on their way. And oftentimes, just even though, again, the nocebo is not something that we think of as genuine and an actual treatment, or a harmful something that can be harmful to the body, there's still an impact, and there's still worsening of symptoms because of the expectation.
Yeah, so exactly. We're going back to the psychic implications behind the what is happening internally that's kind of accentuating these effects, kind of exacerbating these effects, whether it's placebo exacerbating a positive effect, or the nocebo, where they tell you that something might be painful when you receive it, and it actually, because of that knowledge, or because you're anticipating that negative stimulus, you in fact exacerbate the pain response. There's studies that actually show this, that we'll get into a little bit down the road. And we also have here actually, before we get into the Hawthorne effect, let's even add on to briefly, it's placebo and nocebo are examples to, again, the psychological influence of medication, of understanding the healing process and how healing works as a whole. It's not just something that happens by means of using exogenous substances to heal you. It's a moderation of both external substances as well as your internal anticipation to heal, or your internal anticipation to get hurt, to feel damage. And that's why there's also stuff like the more nuanced things like the open label placebo and the Placebo, which we have a slide for that, which we'll go into. And so these are all like psychological confounding variables in modern science and drug trials. And the Hawthorne effect also adds to that as well. And the Hawthorne effect, in summation, in the context of what we're trying to explain, is like the Hawthorne effect is, given the relationship that you might have between, the relationship that might be between patient and care provider, that relationship, that the way you perceive that relationship as they have healing powers, almost like if someone were to go to a shaman in ancient times or some ancient healer, they perceive this person as having the medicines, the medications, the healing procedures to heal me. And that perception actually helps to bring about the healing process.
Right. Yeah, we project all of our hope onto in our society, especially on the doctors. The doctors, they went to school for a long time. They know what they're talking about. They have the means to heal me. And so we have, like I said, high hope and expectation that they have the answer to my ailment. And that projection and that hope for the future and the faith that we put in these individuals, in and of itself has an effect on our health. So the medication that they give us is tainted with this this idea that the individual that gave it to me has a wide knowledge basis and they know exactly how to help me. So that adds to the placebo effect and changes
or the nocebo effect.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If they're telling you, you're hopeless and, there's no way you're going to recover, and you have a lot of faith in them, a lot of the times, yeah, your symptoms will either worsen or you'll have no real health benefits.
Again, we have to continually revert back to that that profound wisdom by Marcus in the beginning, which is that it's all in your head. All right. So remember that. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and don't give up your power to an external source either. Understand that you are powerful, and that inside of your own, in a lot of cases at least, inside of your own brain and inside your own body, you have the means to heal.
Exactly. Here we go in a bit more about the open label placebo, talking about, and we've highlighted, the placebo group. So think about a study. You have a control group and you have a group of intervention, and the control group will receive the placebo, whereas the other group will be receiving the actual drug they're testing for, or the actual treatment that they're testing for. Like, take again acupuncture. You have dummy acupuncture where they have these fake needles that they, instead of actually going into the skin, it pierces, but it goes up into the tube as it touches your skin. So it only appears like you're getting acupuncture. So you have the placebo group, but in this case, you're telling that group that they're not receiving the actual thing. However, they do emphasize that the placebo has shown to be very effective in the literature. So even though they're being told they're given a placebo, there's that Hawthorne effect almost, that this care provider, this doctor, is telling you that there is healing property in this, even though there's nothing there's no pharmacological agent in the placebo that's actually changing your physiology.
Right. So if you look at some of these studies, a lot of the time, these open label placebos will be given on top of the genuine treatment that's given. You know, the drug that is supposed to have a real, quote unquote, real effect on the health of the individual. On top of that, they'll give them, hey, here's this sugar pill, and it probably won't do anything, but listen, if you look at the research, placebo a lot of the time works. So take this sugar pill, see if it does anything for you. And what we're seeing in IBS, on top of the treatment that they were originally giving, 60% improvement compared to a 35% improvement with just the treatment. So just that sugar pill, the ingestion of another form of medication, had almost a 30% better results. And we see similar statistics in chronic low back pain, cancer-related fatigue. You give someone a sham treatment that they know is a sham treatment, and nonetheless they're experiencing better recovery rates and better quality of life, better health, even though they know themselves that it's not anything real.
Yeah, but that also applies for the placebo in this case. And the placebo is kind of like the antithesis of the open label placebo. So telling the group that they're receiving a placebo, but I don't know, I haven't seen where like they actually omit telling them that it has healing properties, but because we typically associate the placebo as being nothing, that placebo effect is that because they know they're receiving a placebo, there's less of a response
Mhm.
to the medication.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're telling them anything negative will happen from taking it, but they're just telling them this is a placebo. So, and we think of that as just a sugar pill, not the real thing. And so there's less of an effect.
Right. A lot of the time we will see this in cases. So they have to disclose the fact that there's a possibility that you will either get the genuine treatment or a placebo. And so what we see is with that disclosure of information, there's a thought process like, oh, all I got with it was a placebo. So there's less of a remission. Whereas if they framed it in a different way and, maybe said, either this isn't legal, but if they didn't tell them that there was a placebo or there was even a chance that they were getting a placebo, they would probably respond better. And on the other hand, if there wasn't a negative connotation to the word placebo, they might respond better. So, yeah, a belief in faith, hope in the future, and optimism, as we'll get it into later on in the podcast, are incredibly important in terms of the healing process and in terms of every facet of life. Essentially, there's, it's essentially a self-fulfilling process or prophecy. If you believe in the possibility of health, then you're more likely to become healthy.
Right. And yeah, like that's in one aspect, that's kind of a scary thing to realize, that idea that you play a role in this healing process. It's scary as much as it can be empowering to people, because with that knowledge, that increasing in consciousness and awareness of that you partake in the healing process, um, your I guess your psychological, what's the word I'm looking for?
State.
No, it's like your not. I don't want to say submission to it, but your engagement, your psychological engagement in the healing process, is what helps to bring that about. That brings with it a lot of responsibility, like increasing responsibility, and the fact that like you have more responsibility in your life, and that can become burdenous, but it also, like I said, can become empowering. And we're looking for the empowerment of that to become better healers as individuals. And now let's talk about the targets of the placebo, what the literature says. These four: depression, Parkinson's, IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, and pain, are typically shown to be the most affected by placebo intervention. So using placebo in these studies to alleviate uh, either of these four, placebo is most effective for them, for depression, Parkinson's, IBS, or pain.
Yeah, so a little bit of a pattern that we're going to see while we're going through this. It's not consistent with every single placebo treatment, but a good chunk of the time, what we're seeing is in these diseases, there is a lack of an endogenous hormone or an endogenous neurotransmitter, something along those lines, something that you have inside of your own body. And um, something we're going to extrapolate on a little bit is the ability that we have as humans to regulate our autonomic nervous system, things that are typically understood as outside of our control in certain circumstances and with practice can become inside of your own control. You can regulate your own state of being through regulating the processes inside of your own body. And sometimes it takes a little bit of a trick to regulate those processes. You need to kind of be in a little bit of an illusion to believe fully that it can happen. But if you look at the research, it can in fact happen. You can change your levels of serotonin, dopamine, or the endogenous opioids in your system and bring about real healing.
Yeah, I just think it's tricky to say that it's an illusion to believe it, because is it really an illusion if it brings about the healing?
Right. Well, what I mean by illusion is that in most cases, the placebo is they kind of have to trick them into believing that it might be the real medication. So they have to go like, this will help you. And, the person isn't in the case of an open label placebo, this doesn't apply, but in the vast majority of the experiments they've run, the people truly believe that they're getting a genuine treatment, and that belief has a very real effect on how well the placebo works. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, it is a little bit of an illusion, and that illusion is necessary to bring about the amount of belief that is necessary for you to respond fully.
Yeah, it's almost like this is kind of maybe the opposite of that sense, but it's like you're eating something, that someone made, and you're like, oh, this is really good, I really like this, but then they tell you what's in it, and maybe something that's in it is something that you don't like, and then all of a sudden you don't like, you're like, I don't want to eat this anymore,
Right.
even though you enjoyed it being in that illusion that, or in that original state, you felt it to be good, or like it tasted good, but them telling you that shifted your perception of what it was, and even it shifted your how you received the taste of it. And in the same way, someone tells you this is healing, and because they tell you that, especially if it's coming from someone you perceive as like having these magical powers, almost like a doctor, um, you know, they give you that treatment and it brings about healing, but then they might tell you later that it doesn't, or that it wasn't real. And that might, and I didn't see anything in the studies we referenced, but I would imagine that could lessen, depending on the person, that could lessen the effect of it.
Well, yeah, there's almost like an embarrassment that comes along to responding to a placebo. Like, say someone gives you non-alcoholic beer and you respond as if there was alcohol in it. Then someone discloses that later on. All of a sudden, you're sober and you're embarrassed because, you were faking. When in reality, if we threw you into a PET scan, maybe some of the things that you would expect from genuine alcohol were happening inside of the brain. And we'll see this in the slide on pain. There are genuine physiological effects in terms of believing that you ingested what you thought you were believing. It's not just an illusion or a subjective report that happened because you were tricked into believing something. Real effects happen, measurable effects happen from what you believe to be the case.
Yes, very well put. So let's go ahead and dive into the targets. Depression being the first one. let's go ahead and Landon, you looked into this study, so riff on this a little bit and tell us a little bit more about antidepressants and depression. It's it's easy to see how well, maybe not easy, but you can see the psychic implications in a placebo from something like depression, especially mild and moderate depression. The literature shows that placebo is less effective, and actual drug intervention is helpful in cases of like major depressive disorder, so major cases, severe cases. However, like it says here, that 68 percent. Sorry, I'm blocking it here. Um, the placebo effect accounts for up to 68% of the effect of the medication.
Right. So this is a pretty controversial subject. There was a book written called The Emperor's New Drug, where someone was taking this information and essentially rallying against the use of antidepressants, saying, Big Pharma is lying to us. Psychology is not utilizing effects that are, or utilizing medication, not being truthful about the efficacy of some of these drugs that they're handing out. And it is, it's a big subject. You can find lots of articles that are kind of riffing back and forth on, some of the confounding statistics and arguing about what we can make of this. And the important thing to remember is, like we were going over, it's not that, that 68% is nothing. That 68% is genuine remission. So if you look at this graph, what you see is a comparison between the observed change of antidepressant medication versus the observed change of a placebo response. And so towards more mild cases of depression, there's a very real effect with placebo. And it's very powerful, and it's pretty much on point or a little even better than the actual medication. But as you go down the line, more severe forms of depression have less efficacy with placebo. So the placebo is essentially the thing that we need to be looking at and understanding. It's not nothing, like we'll continue to reiterate. The placebo effect has very real changes and is a very easily measured has a very easily measured impact on the mental health of the individual who believes it to be something that will help them. And in these trials, another important thing to remember is that while they are ingesting a placebo, they're also in an environment that's very conducive to a good Hawthorne effect. So they're surrounded by psychotherapists, they're surrounded by people that are experts in the field, and these experts are giving them hope for the future. These experts are saying, hey, this may or may not help. It probably will, but if it doesn't, there'll be other things down the road that'll help you. So finally, these people that have been suffering for so long have the opportunity to be in the presence of someone who truly cares about their mental health and who is an expert in the field. So that hope in and of itself, that releases certain chemicals that will help elevate a mood. Things like oxytocin. If you're, Noah and I were chatting before the talk. We were talking about how, you can get oxytocin from, petting your dog. Having a living being that obviously loves you releases these love hormones. So it's not far-fetched to assume that being in the presence of an individual who is actively being compassionate towards your mental state will release chemicals that will help you feel better. So while in a lot of cases, antidepressants may be prescribed in a situation that they won't necessarily help very much. Even if they are, and it's not the antidepressant that is helping you, and it's just a placebo response, there's still an impact. There's still an opportunity to heal from that and recover quickly.
Yeah, because when you take a pharmacological agent like an antidepressant, an SSRI, for example, in the case of depleted serotonin, I know there's other medications that have been used to relieve depression, like tricyclics, and other, I can't, the names escape me right now, but there's other pharmacological agents that, other pharmaceuticals that they use to treat depression. However, low serotonin is another example of like a hormonal fluctuation based on like interpersonal relationships. So, you talked about oxytocin being released when you make eye contact with your dog, or you're in a loving, healing relationship. You have physical contact with another. And the serotonin is yet another example of our hormonal fluctuation as we perceive ourselves in a dominance hierarchy, for example. So, like they show in primates, that as they ascend the dominance hierarchy, they have higher serotonin, and vice versa. As you go into the lower orders, there's lower serotonin. And that serotonin has a relationship with the activation of the amygdala, which is primarily responsible for threat detection. So lower serotonin actually, it allows for a hyperactive amygdala, so you're more neurotic, whereas a higher serotonin will deplete that or dampen that amygdala response. And also you become, with higher serotonin, you're more expansive, and it's known as a mood enhancer, hence why it's used to treat depression. So it's just another example of external factors, lifestyle factors even, that go into treating these pathologies, treating depression. And it's not necessarily that, it's not the external thing, the chemical intervention that's bringing about the healing, but it is these more, it's showing that their roots might be more psychic, mm-hmm. especially where the placebo is stronger, which is in the case of these, what we're talking about.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, using that analogy of a chimpanzee or another primate that is lower in the dominance hierarchy and is experiencing negative emotion as a result, just because of the way our biology is constructed. If you're in a position in life where you don't have a loving relationship, and there could be a lot of causes before that, and then you get one loving relationship, and this person is shifting your perception of where you are at in the hierarchy. Suddenly you're being respected, suddenly someone cares about you, suddenly you have a meaningful interaction with another human being. That's going to change the way that your unconscious processing of your position in life changes. And therefore, like you were getting to, an increase in serotonin, decreased activation of the amygdala, and a lowered stress response, as well as the release of hormones that will elevate your mood. So the question is, how can we frame our circumstances to be conducive to a optimal chemical concoction inside of our brain? What can we do that's in our own power to shift and to shift our perception of what life is, and with our shifted perception of life, see real impacts on our mood or our physical well-being.
Right, because our primary paradigm that we're living in is that typically, more and more in the medical community, I'd say, we perceive health as a means of chemical balance, as a means of like homeostasis in the biochemical sense, and that all these hormones are fluctuating in equilibrium in certain amounts that we've measured and that we've based off of previous studies that we assess to be healthy amounts. And that's true to a certain extent. However, it kind of almost shunts off what has been developing, that is the realm of psychology, that is the realm of our experience, our interpersonal relationships, and how those more subjective aspects of reality influence physical health as well, influence our state as well. Now let's get more into Parkinson's disease, and we kind of talked about this before, and you as well listening might be, intuitively think of this as a bit strange to have Parkinson's as a prime target of placebo, because Parkinson's, whereas IBS, pain, and depression, you can understand how those are more psychological in origin. Parkinson's disease seems to just be this general progression of physical degeneration. And now there's ways to mitigate that, I'm sure, over time. However, it isn't as obvious as to how this placebo response, or this placebo effect when given a placebo, how it creates this endogenous release of dopamine from a damaged area of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is like the area in the brain that is seen to be damaged in people with Parkinson's, so they can't produce enough dopamine. But they're given the placebo, and they have this endogenous release all of a sudden. It's like it was healed based upon their perception of what they were receiving.
Right. Yeah, just to reiterate that for people that don't know, Parkinson's is a disorder that is characterized by, impaired motor function. They'll have issues walking. They may even be wheelchair ridden. They can't, use their arms well. They can't speak well. And it's created because there's a deficiency in our brain's ability to utilize dopamine or produce dopamine in general. And so it's difficult to get the body to increase dopamine. What they use currently is something like levodopa, and there's a few other medications that do essentially the same thing, which is increase they utilize the precursor to dopamine, which allows the brain to produce more. And so, like you were getting at, it's amazing that we can see very real improvement in something objective like motor function or speech, because this isn't just someone going like, oh, I have a lot of pain. We can't see the pain, but we can see impaired motor function. And so you can measure a increased motor function. You can measure improvement objectively. And so with these placebos, it's amazing to see these improvements, because it's nothing, and yet the brain goes, okay, now I'll produce more dopamine, therefore symptoms improve. And like we were getting at earlier on in the podcast, this is something that dopamine is an endogenous chemical where our brains produce it naturally. So by tricking an individual into producing more, well, maybe not tricking the individual, but tricking the individual's brain, this process that they have relatively no control over, the production of dopamine. By tricking that process into action, we see improvement.
Yeah, just a quick question. Can you see this upgrade to Mac on my screen?
No, I can't.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah.
Because didn't want to skew the presentation, screw it up too bad. So, anyways, but yes, going back to what he's talking about, Parkinson's, it acts primarily on the dopaminergic system, and I think that what's interesting about that, and one idea is how the placebo might be so effective in something like Parkinson's, is that when given the placebo, I could understand the brain almost wants to have a dopamine response, almost like it's being rewarded for receiving some healing ailment. So that very system that's deficient in Parkinson's is being activated because you're receiving, in a sense, a reward to that, because it brings about healing. So that could be, that's like my kind of speculation as to how that might work. I don't know what you think about that, or any thoughts you have about that.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting to see the role of classical conditioning. A conditioned response has a greater placebo effect. One of the studies I read, they gave people with Parkinson's a pill and had them wash it down with a very specific flavored drink, something really sweet, something they had kind of come up with their own recipe for. It wasn't just Coke. It was specific to the ingestion of that drug, right? So for, 4 weeks, they were washing down their levodopa with this, grapefruit drink. Then one day they take away the levodopa and they give them just the grapefruit drink. The same effect that the medication had was seen just with the flavor of the drink. So the brain, it draws connections and it goes, okay, that this flavor goes along with this response that I do. So, it's interesting to see this response from something. They weren't even giving him a placebo at this point. It was just the flavor sparked an increase of dopamine.
Hmm. That is, yeah. I'm just thinking about that. There's a lot of, there's a lot of ideas behind, and of course there's ongoing discussion as to how this mechanism is at play. But before we move on to talking about IBS, I just wanted to highlight this picture we have included, which is showing, it's like a brain scan, essentially showing a. You could read it here, where there's tracer displacement. So raclopride binds to D2 receptors, and after they were given a placebo, that binding, that raclopride, uh, it can't bind as well to the D2 receptors because there's endogenous dopamine release. Hence why you see less coloration in the after placebo slide. So this is like actual neural imaging showing this placebo response.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Now, oh,
What
sorry.
we,
Go ahead.
I was just going to mention that's kind of what we were getting at is this isn't just some subjective report like, oh yeah, my symptoms are better. This is something that you can measure, and this is something that it's not an illusion. This is something that the brain is doing in response to nothing, essentially.
Not nothing.
Not
Not
nothing,
nothing.
but pretty much nothing.
On the
It's
outside, it's not. On the outside, it seems like nothing, but you have to encompass that the way in which you receive it,
yeah,
because that in a way makes it nothing. But
yeah.
you can choose to make it nothing.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting to see the people that are, that are delving into this subject, or some of them are rallying against the use of the word placebo because it's in most trials, people are disregarding placebo as some kind of nuisance that they have to overcome in order to prove that their drug is doing something. When in reality, it would be, um, it would make more sense to compare it to no treatment instead of a placebo, because the placebo works so well in so many cases that it's really not, it's not a very good control, and it's used as a control because it's believed to be nothing, where in fact that nothing is helpful for some reason.
Exactly. Again, because it goes on to show the more holistic aspects of blending the effects of the external world with the internal world.
Mm-hmm.
The internal state and the external state come together to shape our health, to shape how we function overall.
Yeah, later on in the podcast, we'll get into more placebo works better than less placebo. And I was reading, someone was discussing that fact, and they were saying, four nothings should not be more than two nothings, but everyone knows four is more than two. So, it's obvious that taking more placebo has more of an effect in a lot of circumstances. Taking less has less of an effect. So if it's just sugar or bread or just a sham procedure, it shouldn't have an impact how much of that sham there is. But what we see is it has a very real, very measurable impact on, across the board.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we see the same thing with IBS, which is irritable. Again, it's irritable bowel syndrome. This is a specific study, which is a randomized control trial. We haven't really talked about the hierarchy of studies, what's considered like high quality studies. If you go back, you'll see that meta-analysis is highlighted. I believe this was a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are trials where a group of people they gather this population. They have certain inclusion and exclusion criteria, and once they get this population together, they randomly assign them to either the control group or the group where they're receiving some specific intervention. And in some cases, it can be further divided into like quartiles, where there's 4 different groups receiving, like, depending on how long the treatment lasts and whether there's like a combination of they're receiving no treatment, this group receives placebo and then the treatment, and this group receives treatment and a placebo, and this group receives just treatment, just placebo. But the main idea is that they're randomly assigned, and they have no idea as to where the people in the study have no idea as to which group they're in. And it makes for the best results overall of the study. And a meta-analysis is pretty much gathering, like a meta-analysis of randomized control trials is gathering a bunch of different randomized control trials and taking a overall view of each of these studies and seeing what their results were. So it's aggregating all of these different studies. That's what a meta-analysis is. This is a randomized control trial of placebo effect in IBS. And as you can see, they have 262 people total. That's the study population. And they use the placebo, they use as dummy acupuncture. Again, that's where the needle is not, there's no actual needle being inserted into the patient. It is just pressing their skin and then going back into the tube or the syringe.
Right.
So it only appears.
It's like a prop knife. So you
Right.
In a play, you stab someone with a knife, the knife contracts back into the handle.
Exactly. And so that's what they were using for this. And there's 3 groups. One was called waiting list. So it's the first one where there's no placebo or interaction with a healthcare provider. Then there's second and third. And the second group receives the placebo. But this is the important part, because they receive the placebo, but they have limited interaction with the healthcare provider. So they're receiving acupuncture, but the healthcare provider, the person doing it, was told not to speak with them at all during the acupuncture, whereas in the augmented interaction, they received the placebo, the acupuncture, but on top of that, they also developed rapport with the healthcare provider. And that's important because following these treatments, these IBS patients, the augmented group improved significantly more than the limited group, as the quote says. But the limited and waiting groups were not statistically different. So what's the difference between group 2 and group 3, where they both received placebo? Well, group 3 had that chance to kind of exacerbate that Hawthorne effect, and also exacerbate the healing aspect of relationship and developing a loving, maybe not loving, but healing and positive relationship with the healthcare provider. And you see the same pattern for their reported quality of life improvement. So after the acupuncture, after the treatments, the augmented group, 37% reported a quality of life improvement, whereas only 20% in the limited interaction group.
Yeah, so
And
that's a variant of the Hawthorne effect. Just to reiterate that the relationship you have with the person administering the placebo has an impact on how well the placebo works.
yeah, yeah, and this is just, I mean, here's another one showing this is a meta-analysis, again, a meta-analysis of randomized control trials. So they use 45 randomized control trials, and it shows that the placebo effect it averages at, with IBS, it averages about 40%, which is pretty substantial. So almost half of IBS patients in these studies reported an alleviation of symptoms with just a placebo, with no real treatment. Um, Also, but that isn't to say that the more severe cases reported the same effect, had a as significant as effect with placebo, because as it says, the more office visits there were to the practitioner, to the healthcare provider, the less the placebo seemed to work. And also when they included something called the Rome criteria, which is something they used to diagnose IBS. It was Rome. I think it's at Rome. They have Rome 4 or 5 criteria now, but this is they used at the time. It was Rome 1 and 2 criteria that they used. But when they included that, that also weakened the placebo response. So again, this isn't to say that no, medications are required. All their medications are a sham, and the medications they've developed for IBS. Although IBS is still not very well understood in terms of and how to go about treating it. It seems very psychic. It has psychological implications, given that you feel many emotions viscerally, and there's a growing body of research between the relationship between the gut and the brain through the vagus nerve, and how the gut and the brain are like the two most metabolically expensive tissues in the body. So it's easy to see, like through knowing that there's this correlation, this relationship between the brain and the gut, and that the gut was almost our first brain, really. That because based on evolution, we grew out of a larger gut and a smaller brain, and so we felt, we were more animalistic in that sense, and so a lot of our evolutionary biology is rooted in our body and in our gut. So, and that includes our emotions. Emotions are like relegated to the body, whereas now we have our minds, our reasoning faculties, our intellect to govern those emotions. Um, and so if you're chronically stressed, like chronic stress is shown to be very prevalent in IBS, and that contributes a lot to like IBS symptoms. And what that means is, like, if you have a chronic negative stimuli, you're holding on to this negative stimulus, and that could even be affecting the way you hold on to, in the way that you process waste, even. And so that can affect, like, you're not excreting the way that you're meant to excrete, and so you're not detoxifying the body the way that it should. And that's just one potential pathway for how this stress can go about, um, you know, disrupting your gut and leading to IBS. Did you have any thought? I know you didn't. I don't know if. What did you think about IBS, Landon?
Well, it's we tend to separate mind and body a lot, but what we're seeing more and more, and I think IBS is a good example of this. They're not different. They're very, very much interconnected, and they have a lot to do with each other. So while it is a bit of a mystery, on a level, it makes sense that um, impacting the brain and impacting perception and the consciousness of an individual with IBS would have a real impact on their physiology and on their ability to process food and excrete food. And in the same way that in Parkinson's, they're shifting the conscious perspective that an individual is in fact getting a real treatment impacts their ability to use their body.
And
Their
I've also, I've also seen literature that talks about the environment in which you live has a greater impact on shaping your gut microbiome, for example, than even the foods that you eat. And so what that might mean is like the environment, when we think about the environment, we know that the environment in which we live shapes us. But what we're also talking about here, with the placebo and how it works, is that a large part of how the environment affects you is that your judgments about the environment. So that, again, if you live in a very stressful judgment of the world, if the way in which you judge your surrounding environment brings about much stress, this is going to disrupt your gut microbiome and disrupt your bowels. And that's just another, that's just some more food for thought. No pun intended.
Yeah. It's shifting the external environment is important. Being aware and cognizant and manipulating your internal environment is as important, if not more important, than diet or life circumstances a lot of the time. Which we'll get more into the reality of our internal environment more later on, but a little bit of foreshadowing there.
Yeah, you want to go on to pain?
Yeah.
Talking about pain? Okay. Oh, actually, we forgot about this. This is actually another clinical trial talking about ulcers. And this is going back to what you were saying before, where, you wouldn't think that more of nothing would bring about a greater effect. However, as you can see in this study, one group receiving 2 placebo pills a day for 4 weeks, and people who had ulcers reported, 30% reported being ulcer-free after the 4 weeks, whereas receiving 4 pills a day for 4 weeks led to 44% reporting ulcer-free symptoms.
Yeah, it was interesting reading this book. You mentioned shamans earlier, and in this book, I believe it was Bendetti, sorry, that he mentioned how it used to be, before the development of medical science and medical technology. It used to be, you had some kind of ailment, you had some kind of problem, you go and you see a shaman, and that shaman prescribes, maybe a song to sing, and that'll help alleviate your pain. In the same way, we go and we go to our modern day shamans, which is, maybe a psychotherapist or a doctor and a medical doctor, and we hope that they will heal us. And a lot of the time they can, but a lot of the time just the intention of going and seeking out health and the hope that they give you is enough to heal something like an ulcer. And again, this isn't someone giving a subjective report on their pain level. This is a measurable thing. They're looking at ulcers one day, and then 4 weeks later, given a sugar pill, they can't see it anymore. So I don't know, not quite sure what to make of that, but the statistics here are pretty amazing. I mean, that's 545 people that were cured of an ailment in one group and 805 in another.
Right. And in gastrointestinal disorders with placebo, it's also shown to be effective with dyspepsia and more minor forms of ulcers. I don't know what the severity of these ulcers were here. However, I know that in case of ulcers where there's bleeding, the placebo was less effective, obviously. So again, for the general population, for the rule more of the rule, placebo is effective more than we think, and that just goes to show for more people, they can become more empowered and healing themselves and participating in that healing process. based upon this knowledge. Whereas in more severe cases, people are more of the exceptions to the rules who are suffering badly from these things. They require more intervention.
Yeah, the other aspect of this is kind of the you can understand taking a pill as a bit of a ritual. We mentioned classical conditioning earlier. You anytime you feel pain, you take an ibuprofen, pain goes away. So your body has this perception of ingesting a pill as the road to health. So um, your unconscious, if you want to put it that way, your unconscious can look at a pill, experience you ingesting a pill, and then go, okay, that's the ritual we do when we're going to heal. Essentially, this is a bit of extrapolation on the data, but I mean, when you look at open label placebos, I think it's fairly accurate to assume that it's definitely not the sugar that's improving your health. I think and I would assume that it is the ritual of ingesting a pill and then the expectation of health. So in terms of a placebo, you're doing this kind of, you're conducting magic. It's our culture's version of magic, where we have this little cylinder, you swallow the cylinder, and via whatever magical means, you're better. And that can be, obviously it's better when there's actual chemicals and there's an actual impact that's well studied and well formulated, created in a lab. That magic is better, but there's still a certain sense of mysterious implications on just the ritual itself.
Yeah, and just kind of riffing off of that, like magic is that which we don't understand scientifically. That's kind of why science was born out of an understanding of matter, and almost science was rooted in magic, in that it was trying to manipulate matter in such a way to perform feats that weren't deemed possible. I mean, you can imagine that, because like 400, 500 years ago, if they looking at the world today, it's magical
Yeah.
in what we can achieve. And so that which we don't understand is continually being understood more and more by science. But this magic of the placebo will continue to understand as we go along, as we continue to break these things down via the scientific method, and kind of blending science and magic together. Another duality that you have to balance, almost, if you will. But anyways, and now we're getting into pain. Pain is an interesting one, because and this one has such, I believe it's was it the most effective? Placebo is most effective with pain, chronic pain. Is that correct?
I think a lot of them kind of cap off. I mean, statistically, they kind of cap off at a certain level. So they're a lot of the major ones that are studied are on a similar playing field. But pain is definitely up there.
Yeah, well, I think I remember seeing somewhere that pain was like typically seen as like the most most influenced by placebo. And if you think about that, pain is in the sense an organism's kind of signaling to remove itself or rid itself of a stimulus. So like inherent in the pain response is the desire for the organism to, get better. Mm-hmm. So you can see there why it is that like a placebo would accelerate that means to get rid of the negative stimulus. Mm-hmm. Any kind of pain. We'll get into it later a little bit about like how pain might not, pain can be is psychological, as opposed to like nociception, which is much more is a much more physical type of pain. However, there can be stuff like psychogenic pain. Let's look at this study real quick. This is fear of pain potentiates nocebo hyperalgesia. Hyperalgesia is a hyper pain response. So what these people in this study were told they were given this cream and this cream would have like burning effects. It would bring about some form of pain. They were told that even though the cream was neutral. Um, and what we saw was that there were higher pain reports from the nocebo group, the pain I was told this, whereas the other group that I was just given the cream, the nocebo group reported higher on the frequency, on the pain frequency, no, fear of pain questionnaire, I'm sorry. They reported higher pain. Or no, I could be getting that wrong. The fear, well, I think I have a quote. Let me see if I have that noted down actually. Yeah, higher. So what I was trying to say was higher scores of the fear on the fear pain questionnaire potentiated nocebo hyperalgesia. So yeah, if they had a higher score on the fear of pain questionnaire, they were more likely to be in pain from the cream. That's what I was trying to say.
Explain the study a little bit. The cream was supposed to decrease pain, but it was a placebo, correct?
No, the study was the cream wasn't shown to decrease. They were told the cream would increase pain.
Increase pain. Okay.
Hint, that's where the nocebo comes in.
Hmm.
So, but this is just going to show the nocebo effect, potentiating pain. The anticipation of the negative stimulus brought about the negative stimulus. They used also something called the Big Five inventory. The Big Five is a measurement of personality using these 5 general categories of personality. So each person, based on under this model, each person has a certain amount of extroversion, neuroticism, which is what they were looking at primarily in this study, openness, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. Those are the Big Five. But they were looking at neuroticism. They didn't find any correlation between higher neuroticism scores and nocebo hyperalgesia. So just because they scored higher and they seemed to be more neurotic doesn't mean that they were more susceptible to pain. However, other studies, they cited other studies that showed that other personality assessments that used, I believe, anger and hostilities, those who scored higher in anger and hostility showed higher pain responses.
Optimism was another one that they had fairly conclusive evidence that not in hyperalgesia, but in ability to have a good placebo response, which is the opposite of nocebo. The people who were more optimistic had a greater response to placebo. Just kind of interesting to get into the personality traits behind this stuff.
Yeah, and so the speculation behind this is so we're asking, how does the placebo affect the way in which, or nocebo affect the way in which we perceive some stimulus to be either painful or to heal our pain. And this is a brain scan essentially showing this activation of endogenous opioids in the brain after receiving a placebo.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little about that, Landon?
Yeah. So originally, before they conducted this this PET scan that showed that the opiate system is indeed online using a placebo, they used naloxone, which it's commonly administered to people going through either opiate withdrawals or an opiate overdose. And so this is an opiate antagonist. So they'd give someone a placebo alongside. They'd give them a placebo alongside naloxone, and the placebo response would be dampened. So they were speculating originally that the opioid system is actually going on and turning on and being activated. And then once they, in an attempt to kind of prove that hypothesis, used they took a look inside the brain to see if it was. They found out that in fact there's a very real effect on placebo. And the brain was releasing this endogenous morphine, these endogenous opiates that it has at its disposal, with nothing but a sugar pill.
Right, like it says, there is a top-down pain regulation from the placebo almost.
Right.
Whereas like cortically, so at the cortex and the more, newly developed parts of the brain and like the more conscious parts of the brain, our perceptions of these things that are supposed to alleviate pain, that it kind of trickled down, top down, to regulate the pain in the body.
Hmm. Yeah, and it maps on to the other studies we were talking about with this these endorphins are released through acupuncture, even if it's sham. So the brain kind of the brain wants to eliminate pain. Pain isn't something that's good for the organism necessarily. So, and we're built in order to respond and then eliminate pain so that we can survive easier. If you're constantly in pain, you're not going to be able to run from that predator that's attacking you, or,
Mm-hmm.
go forage for food. So the brain wants to eliminate pain. It just needs for some reason, it needs some kind of stimulus, whether that be a genuine opiate or just almost an excuse to release endorphins.
Yes, but although it isn't to say that isn't to say that comfort, an organism lives totally in comfort. In fact, no organism that is alive today, its ancestors never lived totally in comfort. So, pain is a signal. It could be even a signal for growth or adaptation, like we'll see with Wim Hof. There might be an initial pain to something like cold water submersion. However, adaptation to that pain or the voluntary submission engagement with that cold brings about improved health markers, as we'll talk about a little later. And briefly, let's go a little bit about nociception versus pain. I kind of touched on this earlier. Nociception is these nociceptors in our nervous system, which they activate in response to potential, again, emphasize potential tissue damage. So it's the anticipation of something damaging to our tissues, whether it's too hot or too cold, whether it's going to bring about some chemical damage in our body, or it'll strain or tear muscles and ligaments. So we anticipate that tissue damage, and these nociceptors are then activated. So I haven't exactly, and it's tough to parse out pain from nociception. However, there has been reports of psychogenic pain, and that is in the literature, psychogenic pain. But again, it's just interesting to highlight this, and especially when you factor in this statistic here, and because it goes to show the psychological origins of pain as well, showing that at least 40 to 60% of women and at least 20% of men with chronic pain disorders report abuse. And so it's almost they're living in an environment where they perceive potentially negative stimulus from the outside. And so even though that stimulus might be removed, this kind of relates to the body keeps the score, where people who are traumatized, who are in case of trauma, they need some intervention or some type of psychological intervention of understanding that the body is still in fight or flight mode. It's still over hyperactive to stimulus, and it's more sensitized to pain because it's anticipating pain. It's anticipating potential tissue damage. But that isn't to say that there can't be psychogenic pain, and so pain evoked without nociceptive action. Can it be? It's more of like it's a question for further research, I would say.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to look at experiments where, a harmless stimulus is applied with the implication that it'll hurt, and the people feel the pain. So there's a famous study that's been researched for over a decade now called the thermal grill experiment. And if you want to try this at home, it's kind of weird, but if you want to, you can microwave some hot dogs so they're warm, and then keep other hot dogs in a fridge so they're cold. Neither of which, taken in and of themselves, will cause any kind of pain whatsoever. And then you stagger them, so warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, and then take your wrist and put it on there. What you'll find is people who put their wrist on this staggered row of temperature is they'll retract their hand as if it burned them. And so it's kind of, they don't fully understand the cause, but it has to do with nociception and your body's perception of potentially noxious stimuli. And so, while it's not actually a noxious stimuli, it's perceived that way. And in a similar way with chronic pain or any other kind of chronic illness that can't be necessarily traced back to something truly wrong in the body. There's still these chemical processes that tell the brain, hey, there's something wrong, there's something wrong, there's something wrong. Therefore, you have chronic pain or illusory pain that it doesn't have a basis in anything genuinely wrong.
Yeah. So again, if you got time on your hands, you got a couple hot dogs that you're not going to eat, feel free to try this out. And, just as someone asks what you're doing, just say it's for science.
For science.
And
an experience placebo.
Yeah, exactly. You should be justified. But let's go into pain, and now we can get to like the goody goodies of going back to our Marcus Aurelius here, because in this quote he's talking about pain and sort of what we can do to monitor that and what we can do to influence how we perceive pain. Because yes, in like a literal sense or in a technical sense, it's very rooted in pain in the body. However, we all intuitively understand pain, like the pain of heartbreak or the pain of losing a loved one, the pain of defeat, something like that. We understand the psychologization of pain. And now we get into what it means to transform from the inside out, to moderate and to kind of affect our placebo responses, to affect our nocebo responses. And this quote, do you want to read that?
Yeah. If thou art pained by any external thing, it is not this that disturbs thee, but thy own judgment about it, and it is in thy power to wipe out this judgment now. So what I kind of glean from this is we have all these ideas about what pain is. We feel pain and we go automatically, that's bad. As children, you scrape your knee and you fall, scrape your knee, there's automatically a reaction from your parents. Oh, are you okay? Oh, what's wrong? Oh no, you're bleeding. And so we get this idea and we stack all these perceptions of what pain is on top of just the fundamental fact your body was saying, hey, don't do that again. Be more careful. It's an alert, a little buzz from your body going, if you do that 10 more times, there could be real implications for the rest of your life. Therefore, don't do it. So it's not that pain is this horrible thing that's just unbearable. In reality, it's your body trying to help you out and guide your behavior in a way that's conducive to a prolonged life and prolonged health. So if we change our perception on pain, we can change our experience of pain. If you're, we understand that some people are, tougher than others. In my opinion, everyone can become tough. And that's not some kind of like masculine virtue. That's just looking at things at face value, understanding them for what they are, and experiencing them without adding on to them psychologically. It's pain. It's nothing else. It's not the end of the world.
Right. Well, if you're looking, I would say that it is masculine, that it's using the reason and intellectual. If you're talking about the poles of masculine and feminine, that is like using reason and logic to kind of modulate the external world and moderate our internal state. That is a masculine ethos, but like I understand what you were saying by that. Anyways, this quote from Marcus Aurelius, it is again an allusion to, we're talking about pain here, and it's an allusion to the fact that if you perceive something in your external environment, if something happens to you, you cannot, the Stoics were big on the fact that you cannot control, except what it is you cannot control. And a lot of that is your external circumstances. But what you can control, with whatever the external world presents you, there is a corresponding chance to perceive that in a certain way. And you choose that perception. And like he says, it's in thy power to wipe that out. And why did I put this horse here saying, what does external mean? Because Marcus Aurelius says, if you're pained by something external, you can change the internal world. Well, external and internal, when we think about an animal, doesn't exist. And humans come from animals. We evolved from animals. We have that animality in us to help us heal even, but the human ethos, the human can split life into two. That is internal and external. That is because we have a consciousness that divides us from the unconscious. And now I'm trying to avoid too much jargon of psychology and stuff, but this is important because an animal, though it is unconscious, it's because of that fact where it lacks consciousness in the same way that we possess consciousness. And there's a lot of discussions and debates that can get into that. I'm not here to discuss necessarily the consciousness of animals, but animality itself, our bodies, they've evolved in a way to naturally heal themselves. And if we kind of understand that, we can use our conscious reasoning to add on top of that to go about healing. So with the fact that our bodies are products of nature, like an animal is, we can use our reasoning faculties to go about exacerbating or speeding along the healing process and optimizing ourselves. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at something like it's hard to parse out exactly what we mean by the consciousness of a human versus the consciousness of an animal. To me, what I make of that is
essentially, for me, it's like the creation of opposites.
The
splitting off from the internal and the external world, whereas an animal, it just identifies with its environment and that it's shaped by its environment totally. It doesn't have that understanding of it doesn't feel that split from nature.
Well, what I was going to get into was that it's increased perception. We're taking in more of our environment and we're extrapolating on more of our environment. We understand more of our environment and we feel more in depth into the nature behind things. Say a dog gets a limp, the dog just goes, oh, okay, like right now that leg hurts. I'll try to stay off of it as much as possible until it heals. Person gets a limp. They think about what caused the limp. Am I doing this wrong while I'm exercising? Will I recover from this limp? Is this going to impact me for the rest of my life? When will I get my leg back? There's more extrapolation. There's more perception. They feel the pain more because they have the ability to shift their focus to that pain and almost increase it by focusing on it more and more and more. An animal just feels the pain. So there's
what I would also say that when an animal feels the pain, it is more in touch with its body, so to speak, that it can naturally, it knows it's more in tune with how to go about the healing process, because it's not necessarily, it hasn't distinguished itself from its body and like its instincts. So it
Right.
has that, it's more in touch with that instinct to heal, to rest,
Mhm.
to engage in like restful activities, to find shelter, and to I'm trying to think of this totally in
Well, it's
animals
not
terms.
worried about its mortality. You know, an
Yeah,
animal isn't aware of the fact that that pain could mean death. Like it knows that on a physiological level, and its instincts provide it with that information on a level, but it's not a cognitive understanding.
right.
It's a it's it's an instinctual reaction to pain as opposed to an extrapolated version of what pain is, what it means for the future, and how to go about putting itself in a position to like a human has to consciously think of how to put itself in a position to avoid more pain and to survive, whereas an animal does that based strictly off of what its body tells it to do.
Mm-hmm.
The human bases it off what its own thoughts decide. You know.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring in the distinguishing between other animals and humans about this, because we go into the talking about Carl Jung in this quote. When you put it in context to what he's talking about, you see that humans, they have this unique group of illness like psychosomatic illnesses, and those are physical illnesses that are of a psychic nature, like psychogenic pain, for example. You could consider IBS a form of that, or um, you know, I would say Parkinson's is a bit hard to include in this, but basically what we've talked about so far have, like, again, like we've talked, they're very intimate with our psychology. Um, in this case, what Carl Jung was talking about here, he was giving examples of patients that he would see healing from after sessions of psychotherapy with him, where a fever of 102 degrees was cured in a few minutes just from talking to him. And then there was another case where someone had whole body psoriasis that was healed like 90% after a few weeks of psychological intervention. Um, and another one he talked about was, there was this patient of his had a distension of the colon, and they were set to get a second distension. However, and the surgeon thought it indispensable. However, after talking with Jung, it was no longer needed. So let me go ahead and read you the quote. It says, "It is almost ridiculous prejudice. Is it almost ridiculous prejudice to assume that existence can only be physical? As a matter of fact, the only form of existence we know of immediately is psychic. We might well say, on the contrary, that physical existence is merely an inference, since we know of matter only insofar as we perceive psychic images transmitted by the senses." That's a
Right.
pretty cool. That's a pretty good quote.
Yeah, I it's interesting to the emphasis on senses. We touch external reality using touch, pain, hearing, sight. All these things are they're glimpses into the external world given to our brains that we perceive. It's not that you can look at something like something like a bat that is able to, or, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if bats can, but bees can perceive different forms of light, that we can't see. A lobster has more photon receptors in its eyes than humans. It can see more colors. So we're glimpsing external reality through a lens, but we're not seeing it in its entirety. And if we were given more um, sense organs, we could see more of external reality. But we're kind of trapped in this bubble of our ability to sense. It's not that the external environment is out there and I'm in here. It's that I can glean a little bit of external reality, but that's mediated by my feeble senses.
Okay, so how do you tie that into the placebo effect in like healing ailments from a psychic origin?
Well, because those ailments are, in the case of pain, those ailments are indicative of something going on externally, or they're indicative of that. You can almost think of pain as a sense, and so if we're only going to touch a little bit of it, we need to understand that that's all we're doing. We're only scratching the surface of what this is. And so to make any concrete assumptions on what the pain means kind of worsens the pain on a level.
Okay. Yeah, and something else I wanted to add with Carl Jung in his work was the aspect of projection, which is, it goes into what he says in this quote, where everything we see in the external environment is a projection of, everything in the external environment is first interpreted through our psyche. Like, it's a priori, means you cannot see something in the world outside of yourself without interpreting it psychologically and inherently putting some form of meaning on it. So it just goes to show with the placebo that healing is very much rooted in your perception of if you'll heal or if you'll worsen in the case of the nocebo, or to what extent you'll heal or get worse, or that you won't heal, depending on like if it's open label placebo or placebo. And even the Hawthorne effect could have been at play here with Jung, where this patients had this healing context with Jung, and they had this development, this relationship that developed between the two, and that helped cure their physical ailments. So we had Marcus Aurelius, Carl Jung, espousing the inner power of the inner world. We also have a more modern example of Wim Hof. Wim Hof is known as the Iceman. He has, I don't know if he still holds the record of the longest swim under ice, but he did for a while. He's done insane feats. He's hiked Mount Kilimanjaro and I believe Mount Everest in just a pair of shorts. And Mount Everest with limited, I don't know if he hadn't had any oxygen supply. I could be wrong about that, but insane feats. He's run a marathon through the desert. I think, did he have any water during that trip?
Which trip?
When he was performing a marathon in the desert.
Oh yeah, no, he didn't have any water.
Yeah, exactly. So he completed a marathon in the desert. He's an example, a testament to the power, our internal state, and the way in which we moderate ourselves or against our external environment. How much power there is in that. He espouses lighting your inner fire, which is, granted, he uses the cold, he uses something external of himself to bring about that change, which is fair because we're creatures of our external environment. We've been shaped by our external environment. But he also uses that to regulate. He uses that stressor to help himself regulate his internal processes.
Right. Yeah. You and I are both big. We're big into the cold. There's something incredibly powerful about utilizing what he teaches and putting yourself in a position where you are coming into contact with something that has the capacity to kill you. In the most extreme example. On the less extreme example, you touch it, and what most people experience as pain, you can experience as something that's conducive to healing and fighting inflammation, but you can also experience it as something that's really pleasurable. It's almost like, people love to get into a hot tub. They find that really relaxing and great. You almost have a second form of a hot tub, which is, a cold plunge. This something that you can do, and something that was originally incredibly uncomfortable, you can experience as incredibly pleasurable.
Yeah, and we can have another discussion all about cold thermogenesis at another time. Over the top, we've included two separate studies that scientists have actually conducted with Wim Hof and his people who follow his Wim Hof method, which is this method combining pranayama style breathing methods where it's almost hyperventilatory. So the goal is to become hyperoxygenated, to develop hyperoxia and hypercapnia a lot. So excess oxygen and CO2 in the body. And then, you dispel all that CO2 by holding, or you dispel that oxygen and allow this carbon dioxide build up when you do a full exhale at the end. So it's like, and then you just hold that as long as you can. And then you breathe in as much as you can and press that. That's basically the gist of the breathing. And with that, there's cold therapy and also meditation. So that is sort of the Wim Hof method in summation. But anyways, they perform studies in showing that the Wim Hof method and his techniques improve innate immune responses when injected with endotoxin. They showed that he was able to control his immune response, not only himself, but the people who followed this method. And also in this other study, they show where they take these non-athletes with these diseases like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, metastasized cancer, and they all trekked Mount Kilimanjaro much faster than people who normally climb it, over twice or almost 61% faster. So it's just performing incredible feats. And he espouses this, and he says that, because he wants to show the world that we're more capable than we think of regulating autonomic processes and regulating our physiology. And that is kind of a variant of the placebo.
Yeah, the belief that you can do it is what I've noticed to be one of the best predictors for a successful cold plunge, it's something that I've done several times, but I've also gone in and failed where my self-talk wasn't where it needed to be, and I got in and went, oh no, I can't do this. This is too intense. And as soon as the possibility of giving up and giving into that cold response is an option, there's immediately it gets much worse. So there has to be a belief in yourself that you can in fact regulate your autonomic process successfully, and in order to do that, you have to believe in the method and believe that you're capable of what other people are capable of, which gets us into, I think, the biggest takeaway from Wim Hof is the regulation of an autonomic process. The ability to use breath, which is a semi-autonomic process, and gaining control over that in order to control your internal state. So, with something like meditation, you see an increased ability to regulate emotions, an increased ability to regulate internal dialogue. And with that, you see a decreased activation of threat response, of anxiety from a hyperactive amygdala. You see all these things happen on a physiological level that are under your conscious control as a conscious animal, essentially.
Yeah, and Wim Hof with the breathing is an interesting thing because, like you said, it's semi-autonomic. It has the potential to be conscious, but it also is equally unconscious. And so it's like right on that border between the two. And that's actually something that Wim and Jordan Peterson talked about on Jordan's daughter's podcast, the Michaela Peterson podcast, where Wim Hof took them through his breathing exercise and discusses why he exposed himself to the cold and what he felt in the cold. And Wim, using what he's learned through the sciences, exposure to the cold, to these primordial conditions, to something that, like a stressor like this, awakens these ancestral genes. It awakens, it allows these ancestral genes to express themselves through us because we're products of our ancestors. Wim says in that, he says in that podcast that we are the ancestors. That's part true. We inhabit structures from the past, these bodies from the past, and we've slowly built on top of that through over time and through our own epigenetic expression, how we go about living our own lives. And Wim and Jordan come to this parallel in that voluntarily submitting yourself to a stressor such as the cold awakens the great father in the depths of the sea. That is your ancestral genes. So just as Jordan has talked about this mythological motif of rescuing your sleeping father from the depths of the sea, which in psychological terms is rescuing him from the unconscious. But and the unconscious is a stressful, scary thing because it's like it's chaos almost. It's like infinite. Now I'm starting to sound like him. It's like infinite potential, and there's a lot that can go wrong doing that. Just like submitting yourself to the cold, there can be a lot that goes wrong doing that. And so the voluntary aspect of it, doing that voluntarily, switches your perception to engage with it in a different way physiologically. So the voluntary exposure to the cold makes it less of a stressor, and it makes it to where your body's it's more adept to the cold, and it's able to tolerate the cold better, and it awakens in a sense that sleeping father. And I just thought that was a cool parallel to throw in there.
Yeah. The ability to kind of take hold of your life and to take hold of your brain and mind and the processes that originally were controlling you, to control those is I don't think there's anything more powerful than that. And it not only makes you powerful, but it's an empowering experience that trickles into other aspects of your life. So you can kind of think of Wim Hof. It's a variant of the placebo because all you're doing is breathing. Breathing is just air, but at the same time, by doing it successfully and having this belief as the fundamental faculty that allows you to expose yourself to something that was originally an incredibly painful stimulus, you can learn to shift that over into something that is in your control.
Yeah, it's not just that it's painful. In fact, it's become something that heals you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that you begin to crave too. It's interesting to crave something that most people would consider to be well, if when you have a different perspective on it, like as a kid, I never went out when it was snowing out. I hated the cold. I would never dream of jumping in, breaking the ice and getting into water that was freezing cold. But that was because my perception of it was, this is pain. And I think that when a lot of people watch someone do that, they tense up and they go, why is that person exposing themselves to something that painful? The reason behind it is through exposure, you begin to have a different perception of what it is. The definition of the word cold changes. It changes from synonymous with pain to synonymous with health.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were talking about with pain perception. It's not always that you should avoid, like pain is a signal to avoid things, yes, but pain can also be a signal to adapt. And the cold is an example of that, where there's an initial pain, but you adapt to it for the reason that you in part are a product of the cold. And this goes into another discussion of why you should voluntarily expose yourself to cold more often. But it's going that you adapt to that pain, initial pain, and from that you receive this benefit of the stress. And on top of that, you have someone like Wim Hof and emerging research and science showing that cold exposure is actually good for you, which only, I believe, adds to that placebo effect. Not to say that it isn't real. Hey, Joe, how you doing? Not to say that it isn't real, but it just adds on to the healing properties of it.
Right.
So, but anyways, yeah, and you saw our friend here, Dr. Joe Dispenza, who is another example of this. There are other voices and other philosophers and other psychologists and other people who espouse these ideas that we're talking about, which is growing the inner world. Joe Dispenza is another modern example of that, of creating reality. We talked about him in the last podcast. In fact, I'm planning in the future to do a book review of his book, Becoming Supernatural, and learning more about what it means to create our reality. Briefly, his ideas is through something like not transcendental meditation, but meditative practices. You sit with the body and you sit with the mind and with its thoughts and its patterns, and you create new patterns by analyzing and observing. It's a very mindfulness-based meditation, observing how your thoughts take you to certain places and why that is. And should you choose to, you can shift them into creating a new reality for the present and for the future. Because a lot of us, we believe that our past, we're shaped by our past experiences. And so based on how we've experienced things in the past, we want to live out familiar experiences and live out past experiences so we can have a predictable future. That's what he says, a familiar past for a predictable future. And what he's about is pretty much shifting our perceptions of things, shifting our thoughts and beliefs on how we can heal, our thoughts on how others view us and how we view ourselves can transform our reality. And we become arbiters of, and we become arbiters of the things we want, of the things we desire more and more. And we become supernatural in that sense. But again, that is for a later discussion I'd love to get into once I delve more into it.
Yeah, the one thing that kind of gets lost in the kind of the new age vernacular that is commonly used with some of these thinkers is that what you're doing is using placebo to regulate another autonomic process, which is emotion. We commonly believe that emotions are caused by the external environment, that we don't have any control to our reactions. But when you look at someone like Marcus Aurelius, who's rallying against that belief, is if you practice, like the same way you practice the Wim Hof, if you practice the regulation of your own emotion, you begin to realize that you have more control over your own internal state than you ever imagined. And I think Joe Dispenza is getting at, and a lot of his work is getting at a similar idea, that take hold of your life, use the ability of nothing to have a very real impact on your internal environment, the only environment that you truly live in.
Yeah, and that's the core thesis, I would say, for each of these men and their different philosophies and their ideas of existence, is that all of their focus goes into the inner world, and it goes into the power of the inner world and building that in relation to the external environment. I think, again, we've come from animals, being animals in the past, or more animalistic in the past. We've come from being so reliant on the external environment to shape us. We still are, and I don't think we ever get out of that. We are shaped by the food that we eat, the water we drink, the people we surround ourselves with, the types of light we expose ourselves to throughout the day, where we live, we are shaped by our external environment. That isn't to say that we still can't grow our internal world, and based on our perceptions and based on how we view the world, we alter and we alter the world as well, not just through a shift in the external environment. And so that, like I said, that is their core, all of their core thesis is a focus on the mind, a focus on growing the inner world. And I keep saying inner world, but it is true. It's nonetheless true. And that is the essence of the placebo as well, as the effect the inner world has on physiological responses in illnesses we see in modern medicine today, like depression, IBS, pain, Parkinson's.
Right.
Those being the primary targets.
Yeah, and that's what we were getting at with that Carl Jung quote, is that I know I've said this, but that internal world is that's the one that you're touching, and that's the one that you have very real control over. These external circumstances that we find ourselves in aren't always able to be manipulated as effectively as we would like. But our perception of what the external environment is something that with due practice and with kind of a strictness and a resolve can be under our control. And that's a lot of the time all we really need. And the interesting thing is, once that shift in perception and that shift in an experience of the external world shifts, the external world is more malleable. We have we have a little bit of a distance between us and the things that are causing us stress and disease, and we can think of better ways to change our lives into what we want them to be, whether that be through the mitigation of pain or a goal that we're setting.
Yeah, typically, like how we think of it, we think of changing our lives and changing how we want to live by changing our external environment. However, like with people like Dispenza and Wim Hof now being modern people, they are on the precipice of understanding and investigating, tapping into the potential of our relatively young conscious minds as compared to our past, being rooted in our bodies and our emotions, our more unconscious tendencies to just act habitually in the world, where these two are they're interested in what our minds, as they continue to grow atop the wealth of information we have today, with the knowledge of science, they're growing and they're tapping more and more into that placebo effect, being able to moderate ourselves based upon how we decide to do that. And over time, I think that the placebo effect will get stronger as a result of that, should we choose to look more and more into ourselves for healing and understand our relationship to the external world.
Exactly. All right.
So,
thank you for tuning in to another episode. We will see you next week.
take it easy.